Okay, you guys, so put your hands together. Here she is, Eliza Wheeler.
Oh, man. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming. I just have a little bit of a cold, getting over it, so I'm a little stuffy, but hopefully you won't catch it. I couldn't just, not come. All right. Oh, thank you so much to Skylight Books for hosting me. Let's please. Yay. I'm really excited to be able to share about this book and about Tolkien with you all. So I hope you're ready to settle in and nerd out a little bit with me, or at least just let me nerd out a little bit. Just in case it gets boring, I have some coloring sheets in the front. If anyone wants them, feel free to grab some crayons and a coloring sheet or take the coloring sheet home. So let's see. All right. So it was in about June of 2014. I got the call out of the blue one day from my agent, Jen Rofay. Is Jen here? Not here. She said, I have a project that came in for you from MacMillan Publishers. Maybe you'll be interested. They're looking for you to illustrate it. She's like, it's a picture book biography of J.R.R. Tolkien. And I was like, Tolkien? Like Tolkien? Like J.R.R. Tolkien? And proceeded to freak out. Tolkien has been one of my favorite authors for some years, and illustrating a bio just felt like a dream come true. The only hitch was that I was booked on projects for about a year out, and I was just keeping my fingers crossed that they would wait for me, and thank God they said they would. So I began the work for this book in summer 2015. It was due at the end of that year, but I did miss the deadline by a few months, and ended up turning it in February 2016. So it's been about a year from now since I finished my work for the book, that it's been in production and marketing and all this stuff. So it's pretty exciting. It's been a hard one to wait for because I'm just so excited about sharing Tolkien with people. Okay, so I'm going to read the book. I didn't bring one, so. Oh, maybe can I have somebody, Adam, will you hold it for me? Do the pages? Here. I don't have it memorized. All right. So, John Ronald's Dragons, the story of J.R.R. Tolkien, illustrated by me, and it's written by Carolyn McAllister. John Ronald was a boy who loved horses and trees and strange-sounding words. But most of all, John Ronald loved dragons. Dragons that flew through the clouds, dragons that breathed sizzling flames, dragons that tied themselves in knots, dragons that wore shining scales, and dragons that guarded ancient treasure. John Ronald fed sugar cubes to the milkman's horse. He swung from the branches of beech trees with his little brother. His mother read him stories about brave knights who battled dragons. But in safe Sarah Hole, a small town in Britain's Midlands, no actual dragons flew through the clouds, only geese and sometimes a hawk. At school, John Ronald made good friends. The boys held secret parties in the library with tea and biscuits. The librarian scolded them for dropping crumbs on her books. They acted in plays and they played rugby. They sketched pictures and made jokes. But at school, there were no dragons that breathed sizzling flames, only the headmaster who smoked a pipe. I wish I could do a British accent for this. I'm not going to try. And I will not try. He says don't try. On vacations from school, John Ronald visited his cousin Mary. They made up their own language, which meant there was an old man who said, "How can I possibly carry my cow? For if I were to ask it to get in my basket, it would make such a terrible row." The grown-ups shrugged their shoulders. At his cousin's house, there were no dragons tied up in knots, only John Ronald and Mary, who tied themselves in knots, laughing at their private language. Then John Ronald's mother died. He and his brother moved in with their aunt. She didn't like boys, and her house was cold and lonely. At night, John Ronald dreamed of exploring a steamy dragon's den. But in the morning, when he walked into his aunt's kitchen, nothing warmed the room. Only a thin wisp of steam rose from his lumpy oatmeal. On the way from his aunt's house to school, John Ronald stopped at the church. There he helped Father Francis perform the morning mass. He carried a cross up the aisle. He rang the altar bell. Of course, he didn't find any dragons at the church, but he did find stillness, beauty, and peace. After some time, John Ronald moved to a boarding house. There he met a girl with bright eyes and shining black hair. He fell in love and asked her to marry him, and she agreed. For a while, he forgot to look for dragons with shining scales. He only had eyes for Edith as she played scales on her piano. All of a sudden, the whole world went to war. John Ronald had to go too. He trudged through the mud. He slept in a trench. He heard loud guns. For as far as he could see in any direction, the war had destroyed all green trees. He tried to shut out the noises of war by making up another imaginary language. It didn't work. It was then that he most needed dragons. But of course, there were no dragons on the battlefield, only ugly machines belching flames. When John Ronald came home, he got a job teaching at the University of Oxford. He gave lectures, he went to meetings, he tutored students, he graded many, many exams. When he could escape from his work, he ate fish and chips at the pub with his friends. Sometimes they read each other stories they had written, but there were still no dragons guarding treasure, only silent gargoyles guarding the buildings. Then one day, when John Ronald was grading exams, he came to a blank page. He wrote on the page, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit." He didn't yet know what a hobbit was. It wasn't a dragon, but he followed it anyway. On school holidays in winter, when the fire was lit and the tea kettle was whistling, John Ronald told his children stories about the hobbit, who, by the way, he named Bilbo Baggins. He gave Bilbo hairy feet. Bilbo lived in a cozy underground home in the Shire. But most important of all, Bilbo led John Ronald over the misty mountains, through the Mirkwood Forest, and across the long lake. The lake! To the base of the lonely mountain. There at last, John Ronald found his dragon. And deep under the lonely mountain, there still lives a dragon that flies through the clouds and breathes sizzling flames, a dragon that wears shining scales and guards ancient treasure. A dragon named Smog. That's the end. Thank you. Adam Wheeler, everybody. So the writer, Carolyn McAllister, is an English professor at Guilford College in North Carolina, and she takes classes abroad every year to study Oxford fantasy writers, so she seems pretty fitting to be the author of the book. The process for me began with taking Carolyn's manuscript, which is essentially a Word doc, and pacing it out into 40 pages and breaking it down into scenes, and then figuring out how to build that scene visually. Whoops, you can see my little storyboards here. I just begin with like very small sketches, pacing out the whole book. I had never done a nonfiction picture book before, and it involved a lot more research than I was used to. Mostly, if I'm working on a picture book, this is where the process starts, and then I go right into refining sketches and creating the artwork. But there was this whole length of time of doing research on Tolkien, and the main biographies that I used, which are really great, are the Humphrey Carpenter biography, and then he has the collected letters of J.R.R. Tolkien. As I read about Tolkien, I realized that I needed more. Oh, that's another book, which is his collected artwork. I think a lot of people don't know, and I didn't really know before I started, that he was a really great illustrator, and he did all of the interior artwork and the original covers for his books. Those are Adam's maps. I'll tell you about them in a second. I realized that I needed more visual reference and details that were difficult to find, partially because a lot of the information in the biographies were information but not visual details. And so I didn't initially anticipate deciding to travel to England to do research for the book, but I felt like I really had to go there to get a sense of his physical surroundings and, what things were like visually for him at the time. Let's see. Back to the maps. Okay, so Adam helped me make all of these little maps. He did all the travel arrangements because I was under deadline for another book, and so it was really great to have my travel assistant who did a lot of research on like where he lived at different times in his life, where he went to school, and all of these different key locations, which were mostly in Birmingham, England, and Oxford, England. We planned for a 3-week trip there, and I just figured out a way to work on the current deadline that I had. I worked on the plane, and I worked in the evenings for a different book. So we were kind of juggling this schedule of like traveling around, sightseeing in the day, and then trying to do sketches in the room at night. That's me working, waiting for a train. I think we had a train canceled, and then working in the hotel rooms at night. And we got to stay at some really cool historic hotels, hotels that Tolkien stayed at throughout his life, and a lot of really great English breakfasts. I'm really happy that we spent the time and money to do this, because I'm sure that I wouldn't have created the same artwork that I did without having this experience. There were also all these great little stories from his life that obviously couldn't make it into the picture book text format, and I wanted to work as many of those details in the visuals that I could. Most of it will probably go unnoticed, but I'm hoping that those details will contribute to the book's feeling of authenticity. So Tolkien was born in South Africa in 1892. His father, Arthur Tolkien, was a banker who came from a family of piano makers in Birmingham, and he moved to South Africa for a position at the Bank of South Africa. His mother, Mabel Suffield, came from a family who owned a drapery business in Birmingham, England. When Tolkien was first born, Arthur wanted to name him John Reuel, and Mabel wanted to name him Ronald. So they settled on John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. Through his life, he was called different names. To close family, he was Ronald. To friends, he was John Ronald. To his adult friends, he was called Tolkien or Tollers. To the wider Oxford community, he was Professor Tolkien, and to everyone else, he was known as J.R.R. Tolkien. When John Ronald was 3, his mother took him and his younger brother back to England to visit her parents, and while they were there, they received news that Arthur had caught rheumatic fever and died. He didn't leave any money for them to live on, and she had to arrange for a new life in Birmingham. She had relatives close by there, and she found a cheap cottage in the country village of Sarehole, just outside of Birmingham. John Ronald loved country life in Sarehole with its rolling hills, streams, and woods. Nearby his home, he and his brother often played in a large swampy forest called Moseley Bog, and they also played around the village's flour mill called Sarehole Mill. Even though they were poor, their mother still dressed them in suits and pinafores, which made them an oddity with the rough and tumble village kids. But he loved the simple-minded, kind, and hardworking people there. And this was the place, more than any other in Tolkien's life, that he felt the most at home. It became his inspiration for the Shire, and the people there, the inspiration for Hobbits. There were all these little details in the book that I had to do a lot of Googling about, because, you don't think about it just looking at the text, but John Ronald fed sugar cubes to the milkman's horse. So then I had to think, well, what does a milkman and his horse look like in early 1900s? So I found myself doing a lot of this kind of research, spending a day Googling 1900s English milk cart and horse, and sometimes coming up with not very much, but luckily here I was able to keep it pretty accurate. Over the years, the city of Birmingham developed further out and swallowed up the countryside around Sarehole. Adam and I took a city bus to see what was left of the village, and it was simply another neighborhood in Birmingham suburbs. When Tolkien came back to visit the village in his later years, he was heartbroken to find it swallowed up by the city, and Sarehole Mill was abandoned. He paid to have it restored later in his life and turned it back into a working flour mill. So now it's a working flour mill, and it houses a little Tolkien museum, which is pretty great. Oops. We were also able to find Tolkien's childhood home on the left, and we were able to walk around Moseley Bog, which is now a nature preserve. It was easy to see how this area became an inspiration for his different forests of Middle-earth. In these very early years, he was homeschooled by his mother, and he was roaming freely in the countryside, and this was really when his key passions developed. He became interested in words and their origins, and was fascinated by passing train cars which had Welsh letters. He loved his lessons in Latin, and was just as interested in the sounds and shapes of words as he was in their meaning. He also loved his botany lessons, but found that he loved being with plants more than learning about them. He loved trees so much that he talked to them, and there were several trees he became attached to in both childhood and adulthood that he mourned the loss of when he found them cut down. He excelled at drawing and calligraphy, and he also loved legend and folklore. His mother read to him from his favorite books were these Andrew Lang fairy books, and you can see that I put the green fairy book in his hand on the left, and the red fairy book is what she's reading to them. And that was when he first fell in love with dragons and the idea of dragons. Mabel Tolkien had converted to Catholicism to the dismay of her family, and she made close friends with a Catholic priest, Francis Father Morgan. Mabel was a passionate Catholic, and John Ronald's love of Catholicism became synonymous with his love for his mother. Father Francis became their father figure and helped the boys get scholarships to King Edward's School in Birmingham. When Tolkien was 11, his idyllic life was shattered when his mother died of diabetes, which at the time was an incurable disease. In her will, she made Father Francis the guardian of the boys, and he found an aunt in Birmingham, just a few blocks away from the church and their school, who let them live with her. Suddenly, Tolkien found himself in a smoky industrial neighborhood with a relative who disliked them. The loss of his mother and his country home devastated Tolkien, and he found refuge in the church as an altar boy and at the school with his friends. We stayed in this neighborhood called Edgbaston, which was a few blocks away from the oratory where Tolkien was the altar boy and where his aunt's house was. Close to her in the neighborhood were the two, what was known as in the neighborhood, the two towers. It was thought that these were the inspiration for the name for his second book in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. When we visited, we realized that the two towers were just at the end of the street where his aunt lived. So I was inspired to add those into the background of the image on the left. And on the right, there was a story of John Ronald coming into the kitchen one day to find that his aunt had burned all of his mother's letters and papers and belongings, not thinking that he would like to keep those. So I wanted to add that detail in her, and I think I made her look a little orc-like. For this scene on the right, when I had to draw the sink, I found myself asking whether they would have had indoor plumbing or not. Would they have had a sink? And this resulted in a whole day of researching the history of plumbing in Birmingham. It turns out that at this time, plumbing was in some homes, but not all. So I'm not sure if it's accurate. But I decided that since she lived so close to the waterworks tower, she would have had plumbing installed first. We'll see. We'll see if anyone comes out and says, actually. Right around the corner was the Catholic oratory, and the pictures we took there helped me to compose these scenes. Adam snuck some pictures inside. The King Edward's School that Tolkien attended as a schoolboy no longer exists, so we weren't able to see that building. And I could only find exterior images of the school, so I kind of had to piece together different image research of libraries in Birmingham from that time and create this image. John Ronald made 3 of his closest friends at King Edward's, who were Geoffrey Smith, Christopher Wiseman, and Robert Gilson. They called themselves the TCBS, standing for the Tea Club and Barovian Society. Pretty mature for a bunch of 14, 15-year-olds. It's thought that this group of boys was his main inspiration for the relationships that created the Fellowship of the Ring. They encouraged each other's creative ambitions, and they held secret tea parties in the library. At King Edward's School, Tolkien insatiably studied Greek, Latin, French, German, Old English, Welsh, Finnish, and Old Norse. Through these languages, he found the poem Beowulf and the tale of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, both of which he later became a known scholar. When he later went to Oxford University, he majored in philology, which is the study of words and their origins. This was considered a science by most, but to Tolkien it was an art, and it was his greatest passion. At the same time, he was spending school holidays in the country with his cousins making up these nonsense languages, but it inspired him to try more seriously at inventing a language of his own. He worked on this language through college, through university, and referred to it throughout his life as his mad hobby. He discovered Norse sagas, Finnish mythology, and the Finnish language, which he loved. Finnish mythologies made him long for the same kind of ancient folklore for England. The Finnish language inspired the language he'd been inventing in the past years, and he began writing poems in the language. But he began to feel that a language is meaningless without a story, and without a history, and without a race of people to speak it. And so he had the idea that he might create that mythology to support the language. When John Ronald was 16, Father Francis found a nearby boarding house for John Ronald and Hilary to move to, and that's where he met a 19-year-old pretty girl, Edith, who was also an orphan, and they bonded quickly. This boarding house didn't exist anymore, but I found an old photo of the road, and we took photos of another boarding house that Tolkien lived in on the bottom. So I kind of based the architecture off of those. Her room was below the brothers, and she would sneak extra food up to them, and they would talk at their windows until the sunrise, and their romance bloomed. He bought her a watch for her 21st birthday, and she bought him a pen for his 18th. So I put those little details in there. She's got a watch, and he's got a pen in his pocket. These are the things I spend my time on. Another little detail, you might remember that John Ronald's dad came from a family of piano makers, so I made the piano that Edith is playing a Tolkien piano. And also on the left, below Edith, you can see the shadows of some bikes. And that alludes to a story of the two of them making secret plans to spend the day together in the countryside. They left on their bikes at separate times, going in different directions, and met up for their date. And on the way home, they had tea together at a tea shop and were seen by a woman there who knew Father Francis and tattled on them. At this time, Father Francis had high hopes that John Ronald would be able to win one of the competitive scholarships given out by Oxford. And it was his only chance to really get into a prestigious school was to test for scholarships because he didn't have any money. And so Father Francis worried that this young love would distract John Ronald from his studies. So he moved him and his brother to a different boarding house and made John Ronald promise not to see or write to Edith until he turned 21. He was 18 at the time, so that was 3 years that he had to wait. She moved away to another city, and after a first failed attempt, he won his scholarship to Oxford, and he would have to wait 3 years to contact Edith. So fast forward those 3 years, he's thinking about her and dreaming about her this whole time. And at midnight on his 21st birthday, he writes to Edith, hoping to renew the relationship. And he gets word back from her that she's sorry, but she's engaged to somebody else. She had doubts that Tolkien would wait that long, and she just began to feel put on the shelf, is what she said. So he immediately got on a train and traveled up to Cheltenham, where she lived, and they spent the whole day together. And by the end of the day, she agreed to give up her fiancé and marry him. The separation of love for the sake of duty is a theme that you can find in both the Silmarillion and in Lord of the Rings. And their relationship inspired two famous couples in his books, mainly Beren and Luthien from the Silmarillion, but also Aragorn and Arwen in the Lord of the Rings. We got a chance to go out to see their grave in Oxford, and underneath her name is the name Luthien, and under his name is engraved Beren. And it was neat to see there were all these letters and drawings from kids that people left on the grave. Tolkien fit in really well at Oxford, and he continued to work on his secret language between studies. The campus lifestyle was more decadent than what he was used to, and since he was there on a scholarship, and he wasn't wealthy like the rest of the students that he went to school with, he felt a little bit out of place, and wanting to be a little bit more frivolous with his lifestyle, but had to buckle down and be studious. We were able to arrange a private tour of Oxford with a guide who could cater the tour specifically to Tolkien's days there. He showed us Tolkien's undergraduate college, which was Exeter College, and the bronze bust of Tolkien is in the chapel there. We were also able to see the pubs where he wrote and Merton College, where he later taught. Tolkien and all of his friends, including the TCBS pals, were enlisted in the war in 1916, and 3 of them were sent to the trenches to fight at the Somme in France. It was an experience that Tolkien hated from beginning to end. He decided to become a signaling officer, learning to speak in Morse code, flagged signaling, and with field telephones. He wanted to be put in the 19th Battalion with his friend G.B. Smith on the left, but he was assigned to the 11th Battalion. And on the first day of battle, 20,000 Allied troops were killed, and their TCBS pal, Rob Gilson, on the right, was among one of them, which was really heartbreaking for Tolkien. On one occasion that remained in Tolkien's memory, he ran into G.B. Smith's battalion, and they were able to spend a few days talking together before he had to return to the front lines. As they walked together, they came upon a perfect field of red poppies that hadn't yet been destroyed. So the detail of the poppies was something that I wanted to hide in that spread. John Ronald made it through some really close calls in action where most of his battalion was wiped out. And then he later in the year, he caught trench fever and was shipped back to the hospital in Birmingham. And there he got news that G.B. Smith had been killed from an exploding shell. And by the end of the war, all but 1 or 2 of Tolkien's childhood friends were all dead. Tolkien had received a letter from G.B. Smith shortly before this, which ended with, "May God bless you, my dear John Ronald, and may you say the things I have tried to say long after I am not here to say them, if such be my lot. These words resounded and were paired with a letter from Tolkien's last remaining friend, Christopher Wiseman, who said, "You ought to start the epic." Tolkien felt resolved to begin his mythology, and he would make it a mythology for England, he decided. So while John Ronald'S spent months recovering at the University Hospital in Birmingham in 1917, he began writing what eventually became the Silmarillion. When he recovered from the war, he and Edith moved to Leeds and then to Oxford for teaching positions. They had their first child, John, and Tolkien began forming new friendships among the faculty, including writer C.S. Lewis. They started a club called the Inklings, where they discussed literature and religion and critiqued each other's writings. We were able to visit the Eagle and Child down there at the bottom, and that was the pub where they met and wrote together. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis had differing tastes and approaches to writing, but they valued each other's opinions even when they often disagreed. C.S. Lewis said of Tolkien, "He has only two reactions to criticism. Either he begins the whole work over again from the beginning, or else takes no notice at all." Tolkien taught Anglo-Saxon, which is also known as Old English, at Oxford University for many years, and he continued working on the Silmarillion on the side. And he and Edith had 4 children, and he enjoyed telling them various bedtime stories. That day that he was grading papers, which was a task he loathed, he says, "I came to a blank leaf, and on it I scrawled, 'In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. I did not and do not know why. I did nothing about it for a long time.'" When I drew this scene, I had to research Tolkien's writing instruments. He used a dip pen and an inkwell, and he also used a Hammond typewriter, so I wanted to get the typewriter accurate. And I also snuck in some of the books that he loved and was influenced by: The Story of King Arthur, Sir Gawain in the Green Knight, Beowulf, and behind him is a set of Oxford English dictionaries, which he worked on in 1920. And for this ending sequence in the book, I had to reread The Hobbit for the ending sequence because Tolkien used so many descriptive details when he described the locations, and all of the dwarves had their own outfit, their own colored cloak. So I tried to get those all right. After a few years of developing The Hobbit as a tale for his kids, he decided to submit it to the publisher, Allen and Unwin, about 6 years after starting it. Stanley Unwin paid his 10-year-old son a shilling to review it, and he reported, "This book, with the help of maps, does not need any illustrations. It is good and should appeal to all children between the ages of 5 and 9. The Hobbit was published a year later in September of 1937, and by that Christmas, 3 months later, the printing had sold out. The publisher did decide to include illustrations, against the advice of the 10-year-old son. And those illustrations were done by Tolkien himself. At the time that we visited Oxford, there was an exhibition called Marks of Genius, where his original art for the Hobbit jacket was on display. So that was pretty exciting. Tolkien's publisher immediately began clamoring for a sequel about hobbits, hoping for something to be ready in the next couple years. But Tolkien struggled with how to create a new story that connected to Bilbo Baggins, whose ending felt tied up neatly. He came upon the idea that the sequel should be centered around Bilbo's magic ring, and that's where it began to grow. It took unexpected turns towards something darker and grander, and something closer to the Silmarillion. Let's see. This project became 12 years of writing, rewriting, or as Tolkien would say, niggling, before he finished The Lord of the Rings, and it took another 4 years to get it published in the format of 3 volumes. The trilogy was finally published in 1954 and 1955, and its success paved the way for a new genre called epic high fantasy. Tolkien spent the remainder of his life finishing the Silmarillion. He had his son Christopher assist him with organizing and editing it, and Tolkien passed away in 1973. And Christopher Tolkien had the Silmarillion finally ready for publication 4 years later, in 1977, exactly 40 years after the publication of The Hobbit, and 60 years after Tolkien began the work. The very last piece that I had to complete for the book were the end papers, and I wanted to do a pattern that echoed a design from that time period, but instead I decided, instead of just using the same pattern in the front and the back, I decided to be a crazy person and do 2 different patterns, the beginning representing the beginning of his life, filled with plants and birds and flowers. And then at the end, I changed those elements to trees and mountains and stars and dragons. Thank you. That's it. At the end. So I've probably way overshared, but if anyone has any questions, Curtis.
Can you talk about how the events of the World War II, how that maybe found its way into the storyline and the events of the book? What did you
World War II or World War I? Yeah, so Tolkien, World War II, he was teaching at Oxford at the time, and his sons, I think 2 of his sons served in World War II, and it's interesting, a lot of people think that his books are allegorical about World War II, but he was really against this charge. He believed that definitely his experiences in World War I and World War II affected what he was inspired by, and he definitely was inspired by those experiences. But I think over the years, it sort of became this misunderstanding that the orcs were Germans and all this stuff, and he said, this is representative of different events throughout history, not this specific one. Anybody else? Thank you.
So I know you usually have a very strong palette for all of your books.
Uh-huh.
It seems like a big departure.
It's a softer color palette, yeah. She asked about color palettes. A lot of my books before this one are very bright and saturated and have strong color palettes. But for this one, I looked at a lot of the artwork from that time period. So I was looking at illustrations done in the turn of the century, basically Golden Age illustrations, and also illustrators that Tolkien loved. He loved Arthur Rackham, so that was definitely one of the artists that I pulled color palettes directly from. And it was interesting, starting out, I had the idea that maybe the colors would change drastically through the book, but it felt difficult to take a character from the beginning of their life to the end of their life and make it all feel very cohesive. You're sort of jumping forward. And so what I basically did was I chose 3 basic colors. I chose a yellow ochre, cerulean blue, and what was the other one? A red color, and Payne's gray. That was another one. And I basically mixed those colors primarily and then muddied them down when I got to the war scenes and took out a lot of the color there. But it kind of goes from very green towards the beginning to a little more like yellow and sun-washed towards the end of his life. Thank you.
You said he was an illustrator himself.
Yeah.
Did you pull anything from that? And did you feel like there was some pressure to have to rise to the occasion because he himself was an illustrator?
I did a little bit. I think one thing that was an issue with this book that we had to be careful of was copyright. And, especially for the last sequence in the book, the Hobbit sequence, I was definitely tempted to look at his work and wanting to almost bring that in there, but I had to make sure I was keeping it very separate. And we had about a month delay where the publisher's lawyer had to go and look at all of the authorized illustrations ever done, which included Tolkien's work, but it included work done years after, and make sure none of my scenes were too close to what had already been done, which is difficult because his scenes have been highly illustrated and really well illustrated. So, yeah. Thank you. Anybody else? Oh,
So
Alex.
along those lines,
Yeah.
how about trying to stay away from the movies too? Which obviously sort of,
You mean the artwork staying away from the movies?
yeah, how did you try to differentiate?
I feel like that happened kind of naturally because, I don't know, I think I had such a clear style that I was working with that I wasn't too worried that, the movie imagery would maybe feel too similar. But I definitely wanted to keep more accurate to the books and the description in the books. So I don't think... And when did The Hobbit come out? The movies for The Hobbit? I can't remember past few years, but I didn't watch them while I was doing this, just to kind of try to keep things out of my awareness.
So it seems like you had an amazing journey as an
Yes.
illustrator and also in England. But
Yeah.
at this point, how do you feel about fiction versus nonfiction?
Oh, you mean illustrating fiction versus... Well, I love it. I mean, I loved this so much. Just preparing for this speech, I know I, way overdid it, but it was I'm so passionate about Tolkien. I think it's so much extra work. It was months and months of extra work. And so if I did it again, I really have to be in love with the manuscript, in order to do it, because it is a lot of extra work. But I'm illustrating another nonfiction picture book right now, so I'm still in the land of research and image finding.
Not in draft form, but in whole other pictures form. Is there a lot that you worked on that doesn't make it into the book, or are you? Yeah, are you?
That's a good question.
You have 12 pages to do, and you only do 12.
Yeah.
Whole stories.
It's interesting. It didn't change a lot. If I can go back to the beginning to these thumbnail sketches, it didn't change a whole lot from that beginning. And I think because I had the framework of the manuscript and all the events to follow, there were a few scenes. I don't know if you can see it, but I had 2 full spreads for World War I when I pasted out, and I had sort of tried to smush John Ronald arriving at his aunt's house. Let's see if I can point him out. Right here, these are the pages where he arrives at the aunt's house, and then these are the 2 war spreads. And the the editor was worried that it was too much war and that those spreads were sort of smushed together and needed some room for a page turn, which is kind of the big consideration in children's books, is where is that page turn falling. But really that was like the biggest change. I think a lot more of it was going there, seeing these locations, looking at photographs, and then figuring out, like, how can I make this scene feel as authentic as possible, but also still get a little bit creative with it. So, does that answer the question? Okay. Anybody else?
Did the author notice a lot of the details that you put in? Were you vindicated and
right. Not totally. He asked, I don't think it ever will. It's, a lot of it's just like for my own nerdy self, I think. But he asked, did the author notice a lot of those details that I put in? She noticed the poppies from World War I. She noticed the Tolkien piano, the bikes from that story. So it was kind of fun to, have her see it. It was totally finished. She didn't see sketches. She didn't see any of that. And so it was fun to get her response. And that's always nerve-wracking, is like waiting for the writer's response once it's all said and done. And you're just hoping that they didn't hate it, So luckily she's pretty happy.
Did the writer get to see any of it before you committed to the publisher?
No, the writer didn't get to see anything, I think, until they did first proofs. So it's like a digital proof. The digital proof was what I used to put these digital images in the presentation. It's just sort of first text layout and all that. So some of them are a little different, but... Oh, no, she never saw sketches, line drawings, anything like that. So it must be scary from her point of view, too.
So the way you drew his face,
Uh-huh.
different stages in his life, did you? I imagine you inform your drawing by what you learned about his inner life. I mean, in terms of what his experiences were, and whether at the end of his life maybe he felt he had accomplished what he needed to accomplish in his life.
Right.
So I just did you get a sense, first of all, that big question? Then was that an active process? I don't know. I'm going to draw this guy.
Yeah, totally. It was, I think, not a lot of picture books. You're drawing someone in most stages, like aging them. I think that was a challenge. It was like seeing, these were the three primary pictures that I had from different stages in his life. So trying to transition him naturally. And also, I think, you can see, like, my idea for the middle character, this was his wartime, a lot of tragedy, and so showing that reflected on his face a little bit. And yeah, as far as like knowing whether he was happy with how his life turned out, I think I don't know that I particularly conveyed any of that on the character, but I do know that he was pretty thrilled with the outcome of how these books did. They blew up in America, which was exciting to him. He wrote back to almost every fan that wrote to him, and some people wonder whether he ever wanted to complete the Silmarillion or not. He just loved working on it. He would refine his language. He had several different languages by the end of his lifetime that he had created for this mythology, and he would work on maps. He would work on this language, just sort of, I think he didn't want it to be over. In the biography, it also said at the end of The Lord of the Rings, he had a really hard time ending it. It was just too sad to like let these characters go. And if you've read the book, books, the ending is quite long from the time that the ring goes in. There's a lot that happens after that. So, yeah, he considered himself to be, he called himself a niggler. Anybody else? Thank you guys. So, one more?
Will this book be released in England as well?
Will this book be released in England? I hope so. Yeah. We know that China has bought it, the foreign rights, so that's exciting. But I think that's the only thing we've heard. It was pretty cool. The Bodleian Library is a sort of famous library in Oxford, and they archive every copy of every book ever made. And so I loved being there thinking, like, this book's going to be in this library. It's so cool. But thank you guys so much. Thanks for coming. Thanks for listening. Yay!
You've been listening to the Skylight Books author reading series. Don't forget, you can listen to this and all our other great podcasts at skylightbooks.com. Thanks again for stopping by, and we hope to see you soon.